Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help you thrive as a cyber risk manager. On today's episode, your virtual Chief Information Security Officer is Kip Boyle, and your virtual Cybersecurity Counsel is Jake Bernstein. Visit them at cyberriskopportunities.com and focolaw.com.
Jake, hi. What are we going to talk about today?
Hey, Kip. Today, we're going to talk about the cloud security and some myths. And we're going to bust those myths with the help of our guest, Paul Rich. Paul
I miss Mythbusters. I'm glad we're doing this.
That's true. It was a great show. Paul is an executive director at JP Morgan Chase, and before that spent about 21 years at Microsoft, most recently working on Azure security. So, Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Paul, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. I just really enjoy. I enjoyed learning about your background. 21 years at Microsoft, somebody who worked on Azure from the inside, and I just think that makes you incredibly well qualified to come here today and to share some perspectives about the cloud and what's myth and what's truth. So thank you for being here. We've just teased a little bit of your background, but I'd like you to introduce yourself, and I want our listeners to know even more about where you've been and what you've been doing.
Well, I appreciate that, and it's fun to be here and to go over background, because I feel like I've had a kind of a combination of all the best Disney rides in my life as my personal and professional life. But professionally, it's like maybe the fun house where I've got a lot of variety. So I started on the TRS Mod 1, the TRS 80 Mod 1 back in the early 80s, and I fell in love with technology then. But I've also been an electrocardiogram tech, a State Farm insurance agent. I spent 4 years in the U.S. Navy and actually worked on encryption hardware devices and computers there. And then after the Navy, I moved out here to Seattle and worked on all Novell NetWare systems, nothing Microsoft, routers and switches. And then because I realized my dream was to work for Microsoft, I worked hard to prepare and got the call in '98 and carried that badge for 21 years. And I was really lucky to get in on the ground floor of what today is cloud, but back then that term didn't even exist. So I spent most of my time at Microsoft in Office 365 and the last couple of years in Azure security. And then I took a sabbatical and then joined JP Morgan. Great company. I was very impressed working with them when I was at Microsoft. And then outside of JP Morgan, I'm also co-chair of the Cloud Security Alliance working group that covers cloud key management. And I'm also co-chair of the International Association of Privacy Professionals, Seattle Bellevue chapter. So I keep pretty busy.
That's for sure. Just one of those co-chair positions would suck up all my free time.
Wow, Paul, that is quite a background. I think there's a lot we could talk with you about, a lot you could offer our audience. But today we're going to focus on something extremely practical, and that is how to evaluate the many, many marketing claims made by cloud services companies, particularly in the SaaS realm, and really focus in and on that myth-busting theme here on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. So maybe just...
There's a lot of myths.
There's a lot of myths. And if you could just kind of give us a real quick overview of the 4 points that we're hoping to cover. Our regular listeners know that we may start with 4 points and only get to 3, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, sure. And before I launch into my strongly held views, but I'm persuadable, but strongly held views, I should mention that the JP Morgan lawyers want me to make sure that you and your listeners know that these are my opinions, and I'm not representing JP Morgan at all here. So with that...
So that's a well done disclaimer there, Paul. So I, as a lawyer, I approve.
All right. Thank you, counsel. So I've done a number of public talks. The Secure World talk that Jake, you mentioned before we started recording was one of them on myths, essentially, about cloud services. More often than not in the privacy and security realms, but sometimes in other realms too, like with availability. And so there's some key points that really talk to the mythology of cloud is one that the cloud, these marketing stories or hooks that they put out there, is their tendency to want to appeal to customers' control issues. Sounds a little like it's a pathology, but
no, that was on purpose.
Yeah, the need for control and the desire customers have. There's a real common matrix that's bandied around the tech community that shows this matrix of control that you give up as you move from on-prem to IaaS and then to PaaS and then to SaaS. And it just gives a lot of people shivers when they look at that and realize what they're giving up by turning things over to the cloud provider. So that's one. And then the second thing is there are consequences of system design failures on the part of the cloud service providers that can impact privacy and obviously risk. And those are things that I would say there's an implied mythology that the cloud providers don't have those kinds of failures, and so nobody really asks about them. So we can talk about that a little bit. And then for me, near and dear to my heart is encryption. And one of the strong mythologies that's really been persistent and pernicious for a very long time now is having to do with encryption and the use of cloud services. Both companies that ship appliances that have sort of custom encryption, as well as the effects that encryption can have. So needing to think about standards-based and peer-reviewed encryption because it is a mathematical science. And the last one, which I think is going to be nearest and dearest to your heart, Jake, is contracts. It's a fascinating area with cloud providers, and one that's really ignored by just about the entire tech community, and will dispel some myths that a lot of people have. So those are 4 key areas we can talk about.
That's great. I love it. So I'm really excited about this topic. It's so important. Everybody's going to the cloud if they're not already there yet. A lot of customers that we work with are cloud first companies, right? They don't have any legacy local area networks, legacy wiring closets, switch closets. They've never co-located anything anywhere. So they've just started out with cloud, and there's so many advantages to it. As it seems to me like we're converging on this idea of utility computing, and I remember hearing about this years ago, this idea that in the future computing would be like electricity. You would just have a wall socket anywhere you went, and if you wanted electricity, you just sort of plug your gizmo, whatever it is, into the wall. You wouldn't have to worry about like where does electricity come from, and do we have enough diesel in the generator and whatever, right? I mean, so it would just become this utility. And that's certainly what I'm seeing, but it's not as simple as electricity. It's way more complicated. And these marketing messages are very, very clever. I mean, if we see Facebook figuring out ways to hook people, right, to actually get into, how the human mind works and how human psychology works, and actually can, figure out ways to keep us engaged, even when we should probably be doing other things, you can bet that there's a lot of human psychology behind the marketing messages from the cloud companies, and so we just got to be able to separate truth from fiction, especially CISOs and senior decision makers. I mean, these are critical thinking people, and if we can get them the facts, then they're going to be making better decisions, and that's really what they do, right? Is that they are corporate decision makers, and so we want to make sure that we're setting them up for success. So we've got some points that we're going to explore here, but what kinds of things should people be asking their cloud service sales reps?
Yeah, I really like to try and help people think about how to maybe flip or migrate their questions from what they typically ask to what they really should be asking. So a simple example of that is the most common answer or question, that to go back to the control issue is, can I have control of something, of whatever, fill in the blank? And what they really should be asking their cloud provider is, will this prevent you from responding to a legal order, for example, for my data? Or will this prevent your personnel from being able to access my data. So that's a simple transition from, can I have control of, the encryption key, to what are you really asking for? And then, instead of asking what's your SLA or what's your uptime, asking how is your cloud service or your technology underpinning it most likely to fail?
Oh, that's a great one, by the way. Let me just, I want to inject an idea here, which is negative visualization. Have you heard of that particular turn of phrase, Paul?
Educate me.
Yeah. So negative visualization, right? This is sort of like what decision makers should be doing, but that they never do, because they're always thinking about their happy path, right? Hey, we're going to migrate to the cloud and all these problems that we have are going to go away. And, and then we're going to be able to deal with all this other cool stuff that we've always talked about. So they always think about how everything's going to go right. What they don't often do is think about and talk about, how could things go wrong? And can we prepare for that somehow? So I love this question that you've brought up, because I think it's a great example of this idea of negative visualization. And I think it's a really important part of risk management.
I'm pretty sure that negative visualization is actually just being a lawyer.
Or a risk manager. Yeah, right.
Certainly that's.
Well, what did
you, wasn't
there a course on that in law school?
Yeah. The whole thing.
Yeah, so I can't remember the name of the book, but I read a very influential book back a long time ago when I was at Microsoft, and the title of the book and the theme of it was disasters, man-made disasters. So it went through like 3 Mile Island, space shuttle, various very, so they were focusing on very complex systems, not simple man-made disasters, but really highly complex things like a nuclear power plant, and how the like what you're saying, Kip, how the designers of those systems, actually people on the ground probably did have some ideas about how it might fail, but at the upper echelon, they really saw this as kind of a bulletproof system. And then when those systems failed, you look at something like Fukushima, just absolute, incredible disaster, but also a wake up moment where you kind of, those of us in the public looking out from the outside in would go, well, gee, that seems kind of obvious. Tsunamis happen in the Pacific Ocean, you locate. So the cloud is like that. The technologies underpinning something like Amazon or Microsoft are very complex, and there's so many different ways they can fail. And we don't take the time to focus on that. We're focused on SLAs and penalties for SLAs. So yeah, we can talk about that a little bit. And then on the last two questions I would bring up would be, on the encryption piece, if a vendor or a cloud provider is starting to talk about encryption, I would got to nail them to the wall on, where's the standards body community on this. There's the IEEE, if your listeners aren't familiar with, in the engineering field, the international bodies that govern internet standards. You have to be using an internet standard if you're using encryption. If you're not, you've gone rogue in that community, and no one really can trust what you have implemented. So it's a peer review model like any scientific endeavor. And then lastly, when you see a marketing claim about privacy and security, you really want to ask, what does the contract say about this? So that'd be the final and maybe even the most important question.
Very good. That is, I think that's all of that is just critically important, and I think it's oftentimes not something that people always think about it. Particularly as we were talking about the negative visualization. I like to think of that as everyone being a lawyer. The standards body one is really, really critical too. I think, I don't know how often, and I know there's a whole kind of talking point about this, but my favorite kind of marketing speak to kind of dig into is, oh, you have a proprietary encryption mechanism? That's so fascinating. But that just goes to your standards body publication and kind of protocol. So let's go ahead and kind of move into those four primary components. And I think the first one was talking about people's control issues, which we all have. Um, and what I see is that, I think a lot of our shared clients, Kip and I shared clients, as you mentioned, are cloud first, and it's almost like they're not thinking about the giving up control in the same way, because they're just kind of used to that. But we also have clients with huge, I'm going to use the L word, legacy networks, and they definitely, I would say, sometimes to their detriment, refuse to give up control. So maybe speak to the value of control, what it really is. Is it some kind of goal in and of itself? In other words, an outcome, or is it really just a tool, a component of an overall system? And let's go ahead and discuss that first.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic with cloud first entities, and I would love to hear your experiences with companies like that maybe have turned a corner on how they, let's say, kind of ride along making assumptions, and they're happy and sort of blissfully ignorant of the contract in this case, with respect to privacy and their data. And then as they grow up a little bit and they've got, maybe they start out paying attention to the startup, issues that their attorneys are going to take care of for them. And once they graduate to a situation where maybe they start talking to peers, and their peers are saying, well, so-and-so had, the data that was subpoenaed to a cloud provider, and that was turned over, and then they're starting to pay attention to it, and then that raises the question of control. So they, even later on, those cloud first companies might be coming back and going, this is an area where I'd really like to protect myself, and what can we do here? And what they'll see is the marketing around, you can control access to your data, or that Microsoft has a key feature in that arena, but all the cloud providers will market to you, hey, you can control your encryption keys. And so the smart person is going to respond to that by saying, okay, so my goal is to ensure my data can't be subpoenaed. Is that going to actually address that concern? Is that going to accomplish that goal? And this was an area I spent many years at Microsoft addressing with customers, and so answering that question. And my experience is that universally with SaaS providers, the answer is no. There's no way around that. With IaaS and PaaS, the dynamics can be different, but it's always the case with SaaS that the answer to that question is going to be no. That encryption control is not going to give you protection against that scenario, and that includes the insider threat from the cloud provider, so their personnel being able to access your data.
Isn't it the case that if you actually read Slack's privacy policy, they never actually say that Slack itself can't read your information? I mean, they could hypothetically.
Yeah, and there's a good reason why contracts don't include language like that. Not just because they might want to leave it intentionally open, but because Slack doesn't know if they can read your data, because you could put data into Slack service that's already been encrypted on premises using encryption keys that Slack can't access, and so they can't ever see the data. So, that's an option with any of the SaaS services. With any cloud service, you can encrypt data and stick that data into the cloud, versus putting it into the cloud and having the cloud encrypt the data for you. If the cloud is encrypting your data, then your data is available to the cloud personnel. It's available for them to respond to a third-party data request, and that's the key differentiator there. Are you encrypting your data and the cloud can't decrypt it, or are you letting the cloud encrypt your data, and therefore they obviously can decrypt it?
Yeah, that's a really, really important point.
And even if a human being isn't reading your data, you get situations like Google Ads where they were using automated systems to read messages that were being sent around, and so that they could serve up ads, right? So that's kind of creepy.
Well, yeah, I agree. I'm not a very ad positive person. And one of the things I was always impressed that Microsoft said is we'll never do that, and they have kept to that. Never's a long time, but they've kept that promise. What they do, for example, in the Office 365 service, is they do read the data in the Office 365 service to populate intelligence in their the product used to be called Delve. It's something analytics where they can say, oh, Kip often sends mail to Jake, and Jake reads those emails in 5 minutes. This must be a close contact, in Kip's business community versus someone else. It can surface things to Jake that you're working on that he doesn't even know about, because it can do this business analytics across your data and his data. So no human is looking at that, but their systems are constantly looking at your email, your documents, all of the content.
Yeah,
you put in
and
there.
it makes one wonder that if a computer is allowed to do that by design, then how could that permission that the computer has be abused so that a human being could gain access?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the insider threat scenario, really, if you're, mostly concerned about the cloud service provider personnel. And my experience, both personally inside of Microsoft and also with a number of colleagues I have that work at Amazon, Google, is that all of the major cloud providers have done a very good job of building checks, controls. In the case of Microsoft, at least the one I know the most about, zero access on an ongoing basis. So no individual at Microsoft that operates the cloud services in Office 365 has access to anything in production on an ongoing basis. So every instance where if they come on call and they're supporting the service, this weekend, they don't have access. When they get a call and they need to jump in and do something, if they need to access production resources, they'll raise a request, get that request approved. The access will be limited in duration by default, a short number of hours unless they ask for more. But once that timer expires, their access evaporates again. So that's one way that the major cloud providers have really evolved from the traditional on-prem where people are, got 800, 900 different admins in a company that size, and they always have access. So there's a lot of insider threat.
And I think, that issue, just about, lit me up completely, because I was just thinking, okay, that's, it's great that the big cloud providers do that. That's one of the questions I would ask the small cloud provider. Hey, how do your support personnel, or how do you control access to this data? I mean, I was thinking just-in-time access is what you were describing, and that's really ideal. It really prevents people from gaining too much power over time, accumulating information. But I do wonder how feasible that model is for smaller cloud entities. And I think that's a really fair question to ask people. So we can kind of, to me, that's probably a follow-up under that first bullet point. What will this do to keep my data secure or private? So yeah, that's great. That's a really, really key, I think, observation / insight that that you've given us there.
And on the theme of control and this particular aspect of it, there's a follow-up question to that, which would be if you've implemented this just-in-time access model, does getting approved for that just-in-time access also include access to customer data? And that might seem like, well, that's kind of weird, but actually Microsoft separated those two things years ago. So if I were working for them and supporting the Office 365 systems, and I did get that access approved, it still wouldn't give me access to any customer data. That's a second approval that's necessary on top of just being able to connect to anything in the data center. I then need a second level of approval, and this is where control for the customer comes in, because Microsoft built a feature where for that second level to get access to your data, you can be in the approval path as the customer. So the operator can get access to the systems, but not your data. And if they need access to your data, they can have to come to you, the customer, and ask for the final approval. If you say no, then that operator will not get access.
You know what is striking to me about this example and this discussion is how even though there's an absolute ton of technology being used and applied here, fundamentally this is a low tech solution, right? The idea of, hey, ask for access, right? And what it reminds me of is the the easiest, best, lowest cost, but yet most effective defense against typical business email compromise, wire fraud, is a phone call, right? Talk to the person. Don't wire money until you've verified it. And what this reminds me of is, like, you're talking about some of the most sophisticated technology on the planet right now, and yet the control really isn't based around technology at all. Like, there is no machine learning going on here. There is no ultra fancy algorithms running. It is a human approval process, and I think that is a really important lesson for everyone to just remember and keep that in mind when you're designing your systems from scratch. The more you rely on pure technology, the more vulnerable it will be to not just hackers, but insiders. And conversely, the more you rely on multiple human beings, the more secure it is, and for the simple reason that it's difficult. I mean, by the time you have to compromise 5 or 6 individual people, now it's a grand conspiracy instead of just one person who's an insider threat. So
yeah, well, there's also the possibility of groupthink as well, right? Just everybody, if not everybody focused on one thing that makes their life easier, and not necessarily thinking about other stuff that that could lead to some real serious data breaches and cataclysmic complex systems failures, like Paul was mentioning in that book that he was reading. But what we've always said here is that you've, as a cyber risk manager, you want to bring all your resources to bear on a problem, right? So if you can get a technical control in place, you can train people how to do things in a certain way. If you can get a process implemented that's going to decrease the risk of something bad happened, and then you get some managerial oversight, right? You can coordinate or orchestrate all 4 of those resources to put on something that's a big risk. That's usually the best approach.
Let's go into talking point 2. I think this is looking like it'll be one of those slightly longer episodes, but I think the value here is clear. So
privacy.
Privacy. Yep. I think for me, this question is privacy, but it's also about system design failure, and how I think typically people overly focus on availability. And what's your uptime, downtime, what's your SLA? But I think what we're going to talk about here is, let's think about just a bit more than just that. What about what are the privacy consequences when a system fails?
Yeah, and because I have the personal experience, and I was still at Microsoft when this happened, I don't want to highlight Microsoft as being special in some kind of bad way here. This happens across the board, but there was an incident that was public. They didn't release a lot of details, but and I won't divulge the details today. But they had an incident a couple years ago where there was a failure in the design of Office 365, and it has to do with how a lot of data gets cached, because in a cloud service of supersized scale, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the system for handling usage. You want to be responsive to customers' demands, for downloading a document, right? All the things that you do with the cloud. And so there's a lot of caching that goes on. And as you can imagine, every operation to the cloud involves some kind of authentication, authorization process. One or both of those things are happening. And sometimes you think, when you design a computing system, I can put this stuff in a cache and I don't need to authenticate back to that cache because I've already authenticated them to a system that is in front of that cache. And so this was the case, the general case here with an incident that happened where the cache had no authorization protection on it. There was you could think of it as a corruption in a computing system that was attached to it, and one Office 365 tenant was able to see a little bit of content from a different tenant. So that should never happen, right? That should be an inviolable separation between all tenants in any multi-tenanted cloud service. So that was I considered that a big deal. It didn't result in a terrible outcome because the data that was actually exposed was kind of minimal. But that was a case where no one thought that something like that could happen. And a customer asking a question, referring to an instance like that, hey, this happened. How could your systems fail in a way that something like that might happen? And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that someone from Google or Salesforce or Slack is going to blurt out, well, this is exactly how that's going to play out. What they're almost certainly going to do is they're not going to tell you anything in effect about the how, but what you want to do is evaluate their response. Not that they divulged or didn't divulge something, but just did they acknowledge that this is a problem that they think about, that they actually do system failure design analysis as part of their development process. In fact, there's a process that runs inside the Microsoft Cloud called Chaos Monkey. Now, just that name can kind of give you an idea, like, just let a monkey go inside your environment, and they'll, put them in the data center and see what breaks, right? It's a great idea.
What wires will they pull?
Yeah, but Microsoft actually designed this into their cloud system, so this thing runs continuously and can go around and break things. And having something like that tells you something about their mentality towards system failure. They want to experience unexpected system failures. And you want to ask your cloud provider, maybe a question would be, do you, by design, have a process that runs around and breaks things? It's a reasonable question to ask.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And what I'm thinking is that, the last thing you want to hear from your cloud service provider is, oh, well, we didn't think of that, or we didn't see that coming. And I think, the truism about computers is that, it's a strength and a weakness. They do exactly what you tell them. And my opinion, and this is just an opinion, is that, the designer of a computing system probably ought to understand everything that system can and can't do, which includes ways that it fails. And though I do understand that today's computing systems are, almost incomprehensibly complex, I do think that this is a type of, I think the underlying question is how robust is your threat modeling? And I don't mean that just like traditional threat modeling, but also just general failure modeling. And I think that's this is a really good point, and I really would like people to remember that and to really ask their cloud providers. So let's go ahead and move into the third talking point regarding the importance of peer review for encryption models and things like that, because I think that's one of the more common claims that you hear is, oh, such and such is fully encrypted, end-to-end encryption, at rest in transit. And I think for a lot of folks, encryption is a word that, for better or for worse, people just tend to trust it. Like, oh, it must be true. If they say it's encrypted, it must be true. That's at least my impression of the non-technical, portion of customers. But why don't you go ahead and bust that myth?
Well, yeah. So, thanks, Jake. I've been trying to come up with a kind of an analog to this in the non-computer science world, and haven't found a good one yet. But the best I can come up with right now is maybe a brain surgeon. If you needed brain surgery, very complex operation, a lot of risk associated with it, and it's something that's not done by very many people in the world. You probably actually don't want to hear, hey, we've got this brand new technique. No one's ever tried it before. And even though you're able to use all of the existing techniques of brain surgery for this problem, we're going to try something totally innovative and new on you. You might say, this time around, I'll skip the innovation and just stick with the thing that's got the good survival rate and, so forth, right? And so that's the best analogy I can draw, is that encryption is a very hard science. It's really pure math. It's just math. And math is not subject to, it doesn't work if some one individual in the world says, I've got this idea for how to, do math differently. No one's going to start using that model until it's been tested through the scientific method, right? So other people need to, understand what their theory is, and then try and replicate those results in a, kind of a laboratory experiment type thing, get the same results. So science is a peer-reviewed endeavor, and encryption is almost, you'd say, one of the most purest sciences that there are. So if someone is marketing a product, a service, an appliance with innovative and new attached to encryption, you more than likely you should just run the other way. What you want here is tried and true, and absent the paranoid, portion of humanity that doesn't trust people like the National Security Agency, I do, as much as anyone could, I suppose. And the NSA is really kind of the buck stops here for encryption in the United States. So for commercial encryption, it's going to have been approved by the NSA and published through the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, or NIST. So if it's not that, then it's probably something you just don't want to use.
And I think there might be some widespread confusion about this topic, because some people might think, well, wait a second, if this encryption method is publicly available and it's this approved thing, like, doesn't that mean that someone can break it because it's like out there, it's like right there? And I think that I understand why you might make that temptation, right? I think there's there's two different things going on here. One is a total lack of understanding of what encryption is, and the other is kind of falling prey to one of the other myths of security, which is security by obscurity. Is that if something is if you think it's hidden, then
and weird enough
that makes it secure. But maybe for our listeners who are not cryptographers, just really briefly kind of describe why those two ideas are false.
Why encryption?
Why publicly tested encryption is actually the opposite of insecure. It's the most secure. And then the idea that security by obscurity in the encryption area, which is what you were saying, is like untested. But why? Because I think intuitively, for non-mathematicians, this is confusing stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'd say the easiest thing for the public to understand should be that, like, how many nuclear physicists are there in the world today working on atomic bombs or such things like that? The number of them is probably vanishingly small, in the hundreds. And in the world of cryptography, in fact, I did this just recently, did a search on like the top 50 cryptographers in the world today, and I think you get less than that in a search engine. But there just aren't that many people that are doing this as a full-time job in real terms across the globe. And it's a very difficult area. So meaning even the people who do it understand it's a difficult area. And so it's very hard to get right. There's infinite number of ways that you can build an encryption algorithm that will have a flaw in it that can be exploited by someone. It's much harder to build something that we think has no flaws. And this is why, in at least in the international community of Western European, U.S., those cryptographers are putting those in front of the National Security Agency, who then evaluates them to determine if they can break those encryption algorithms. And in fact, each, within the cryptography community, all of those people are looking at trying to break each other's, cryptography, and it's how that community operates. So if you've got a company who's saying, even sometimes they're saying, we've got this thing, it's got this innovative new encryption model, and this one expert out there in the world who is a cryptographer has given us their seal of approval, that's still not following a peer-reviewed model. That they're probably not to cast aspersions, but maybe they're on the board of directors of that company, maybe they're an early investor. There's some reason why one cryptographer is saying, yeah, I support this, but that's again, if you had one scientist saying this model works in the world for some other area in science, you would not conclude that is truth. You need peer review for it.
Yeah, it's just so mind-bendingly difficult to design these encryption systems and to design them without flaws. That peer review is the proven process to come as close as you can, but even that is not flawless, because we've got encryption algorithms and key sizes that used to be completely safe that are not any longer because of the advances in computing systems. So even though peer review is sort of the gold standard for encryption, for integrity, things can happen that can change, how secure an algorithm is at a particular key size.
Yeah, I don't know if you've talked about something like Heartbleed on any of your previous episodes, but that's an example of a very public, open community, well peer-reviewed encryption algorithm that has become broken. So, even very, very strong designs eventually can fall prey to flaws that are hidden for a very long time. So, just following that model still gets you the lowest risk profile.
Yeah. The problem I see with peer review in terms of like senior decision makers in private industry, especially ones that are trying to put together some, innovative new product, is they get impatient. They can't control it. It takes a long time to peer review stuff. Private companies tend to be rewarded for proprietary technologies and inventions. And so they just sort of naturally assume that, why should I put up with all this, academic rigmarole that takes forever and that I don't understand? We'll just invent something for ourselves, on our own, and we'll go to market. I've seen that pattern a lot. So
yeah, and to try and make this more practical and down to earth for listeners, right now the areas of privacy preserving encryption, homomorphic encryption, format preserving encryption. These are newer schemes that have developed really in the last 5 or 10 years, which might sound like, 5 or 10 years. Those are still in diapers. And the things that we're using on the internet, commonly using on the internet, are 20, 30, even more in terms of how long they've been around and been tested. So with quantum computing coming on the scene, huge concern in the financial services industry about that breaking existing encryption schemes. And so you're going to see new innovative approaches come, and we need to be wary of those approaches. And particularly because quantum computing, again, one of those areas, there's so few experts in the world in that arena that having your own kind of thing is going to be that much more risky.
I want to throw one more thought in here, and then I think we need to go on to the fourth point that we wanted to explore a bit. But homomorphic encryption, which is now starting to sort of enter into a broader audience, right? It was actually first proposed in 1978.
That's true. Yeah.
So this stuff just it takes forever.
Yeah, and maybe we can have a day to talk further about that. But one of the key characteristics of homomorphic encryption is the trade-off between strength and data leakage or information leakage. So homomorphic encryption always leaks information. It's just a question of how far do I want to turn that dial? Do I want to do the Spinal Tap thing and turn it way up or not?
And I think the last point on encryption is just to kind of hit on that point is that, again, I think other than cryptographers, I think most people think of encryption as, this binary, it's either encrypted or it's not, and therefore it's either totally safe or it isn't. But the reality of encryption, as Kip alluded to with his comment about, older systems being broken because of computing speed increases, it's really, everything in this area is really a reasonable trade-off between speed, performance, cost, time. I'm sure that right now we could easily create an encryption system that we'd be confident will take millions of years to break, even after quantum computing, maybe. The problem is that, sure, you might be able to do that, but it'd be totally impractical and useless because it would take 5 years to encrypt and then it would take 5 years to decrypt. And like, that's just not, that's useless. Right. So I think I just want to kind of highlight that encryption, though encryption is operating on ones and zeros, the overall concept is a series of reasonable trade-offs between these different features, if you will. And I think we probably need to have a whole separate episode talking with you, Paul, about encryption, because it is so central to not just cloud computing, but to computing these days and privacy in general. But I think though it is a commonly used term, it is totally misunderstood. And my favorite example is the executive, who just says, "Well, just encrypt it," and I always laugh because invariably that is not the answer, because that would that would render the data unusable to the company. And like I said, major lack of understanding of what the E word is and what it does.
And authorized users can decrypt anything anyway, so it's not an insider threat countermeasure.
Nope,
that's right. Yeah.
All right,
but
so
let's talk about point number 4, which is contracts, which is Jake's favorite point, I think.
It is, although I really like encryption right now. But go ahead, Paul.
I could tell.
let's talk about the contracts, and just kind of hit that real fast.
I enjoyed greatly your episode on negotiating the data security addendum. I learned just listening to that episode, and there's so much more in the world of contracts. However, it shouldn't be any surprise that most people don't read contracts and they don't want to read contracts.
Oh yeah.
What?
Yeah.
I can't.
Oh, yeah.
Surely that's not true.
I went to get a mortgage one time, and the guy shoved, the whole sheath of papers in front of me. And I was like, I looked at him and I said, I know nobody ever reads these, but I'm going to read them. So, if you want to go get a snack or something, now's the time.
Yeah. You're plus wanting me, Kip. You're plus wanting me. I read contracts and my wife is an attorney, and she is more likely to kind of, shuffle through them. But certainly in the world of engineering, and I would venture to say CISOs, but coming out of the world of Microsoft for so long, in a program management role, even the people that were risk managers they're not reading contracts. Now, there's a fantastic legal department at Microsoft. In fact, I worked very, very heavily with lawyers at Microsoft for quite a number of years. And I actually worked to put stuff into the terms of service for the cloud services at Microsoft. So I had direct experience with how to write contract language to go in there that's going to be consumed by the world. But I think I was the only program manager that I ever met in Office 365 that had read the entire terms of service contract for our own service, when I was in that company. And I don't think I've ever met any external engineer to a cloud that has read the cloud service provider's contract. In fact, it's almost exclusively attorneys. Not even the risk management people do I see necessarily reading those contracts.
Yeah. I mean, this is an example of kind of some of the dysfunction that can occur because we work in silos, right? Most organizations are organized in silos. and those silos don't generally talk to each other, right? So, and we see this all the time where the finance department thinks that IT is completely all over the business email compromise threat, and IT is like, meh, we don't, money, what, we don't, we're just trying to stop the phishing emails, and because the silos don't talk to each other, and I think that's what you're talking about, phenomenon.
It is, and I think what's super challenging is just like on one hand, it makes no sense for a lawyer to review code, and I'm not suggesting that it doesn't actually make sense. You should not probably do that. However, I think it does make sense for lawyers to have a very, very high level appreciation for what code is. And the flip side of that is that even though it's not a valuable use of time for a non-lawyer to replicate all of contracts from law school in an attempt to understand every clause, I think that I think everyone who's involved in it should nonetheless take the time to get a high level understanding of what the contract is saying. And sometimes, and this is true, I think, of every contract, you need to understand the technical parts that relate specifically to the product or service, I think, better than average. That's what I would say is you really should. I mean, you don't have to understand what an integration clause does, because honestly, that's kind of a pure legal thing. But the operative language, I think that's critical to understand.
Yeah. Well, some of the things that most everything will surprise someone, a technical person who's never read a contract by a cloud service provider. But some of the things that I think would just shock people it's unheard of, really, for the big CSPs to include specific feature functionality in their contracts. So if you're looking for example, I'll give you an example, actually, Jake, you'll understand this, eDiscovery, right? We were going to use your email service, and we need to be able to run legal discovery against our entire, corpus of email data that's stored in your cloud service. So I'm expecting to see in the contract that it says, we'll provide you with eDiscovery capabilities. But that's not the case. If you read, Microsoft's terms of service, eDiscovery is not even mentioned in there. So one of the first things that the technical crowd needs to understand is that contracts for cloud don't cover really the technical arena directly in the primary terms of service. They may have addendums that the primary contract points to, and they say, the things that are in that addendum, are applied in some way. But for the most part, they have to keep technical things out of the contract, because the cloud reserves the right to add features, to deprecate features, to change the way features work, to change the way that they're delivered. Everything they put into a contract that's technical in nature can have the ability to come back and bite them by constraining their ability to continue innovating.
Yeah. So every time I log into the Office 365 administrator interface, something's different.
Yeah.
Every time. So you got to be, just the pace of product evolution is just accelerated like crazy.
Well, and having worked again with attorneys a lot, people that are technical, that read contracts and can, basically understand them, are so valuable to the company that they're in, because they're going to be snowflakes. They're going to have this ability to kind of bridge between the technical architecture and engineering and operations and to convey to their colleagues in the technical arena, hey, that's a misunderstanding that you have about what to expect from the cloud service provider, because it's not in the contract. If you're counting on that thing being there. And then the second thing is you'll just have a much better understanding of how cloud providers think about what they do and what they deliver to their customers.
Yep. I thought it was really interesting. You and Jake made a comment a moment ago that I've just been ruminating on here a little bit, and I just want to surface it, which is, reading the contract for a cloud service provider is kind of like doing a code review, because you can't really see all the actual code that's being written to make the cloud service work. But if you could, and if you did a code review, you'd better understand the limitations and the full capabilities of that cloud service provider and the services you're getting from it. But I think reading the contract is probably a a useful thing that you could do. And if you're inclined to do code reviews, you should probably do contract reviews. I don't know.
Well,
That was interesting.
At the risk of creating, I think, possibly the record length of the Cyber Risk Management podcast, but I think it's worthwhile. And hey, we're not going to be offended if people play this back at 1.25x or something. But here's a recent example. I had a client come to me wanting me to review a SaaS product that is involved in basically they're an emergency alert service via SMS text message, but it's all a SaaS product, right? And as I reviewed the terms of service, I realized, this company is basically saying that we're going to sell you a product whose literal purpose is to function in a certain way during emergencies, but the contract says we offer no warranties of any kind. This may not work, and it may not work during emergencies. And I brought that to the customers, to my client's attention, and they ultimately decided that, that wasn't going to work, and that they were willing to pay more for a different service that was technically similar, but that had different contract language. And that's a really good lesson in the importance of connecting the reality of expectations, the reality versus expectations, contracts, and cloud service. So I think do you have a reaction to that, Paul? Does that kind of jibe with what you've seen or thought?
Yeah, that's certainly not atypical. And I think particularly if you look at the concerns that like the CISO level people have, which is privacy and security are almost always, I think, top of mind. Availability is important, but if you run a highly available service, but I can't count on you to protect my data, then I got to go look somewhere else. So focus, even if the contract, say, is 20 pages long, focusing just on the privacy and operational security content. When I left Microsoft, it was a few paragraphs. It wasn't much content to read, but it clearly stated in there how do we handle subpoenas? How do we handle third-party data requests? How do we handle the human personnel and their access to any systems that Microsoft runs that contain your data? So they cover those things in there, and I think most people are going to be a little taken aback to try and go back to the marketing claims that they're going to see, and then read the contract, and no one in marketing is going to outright lie to you, but they're going to tell you,
well,
yeah, your data is totally protected, you're safe. But then you read the contract, and the contract's going to tell you, look, we have to respond to legal requests. If we can, we will. If we can tell you that we received it, we will. But if we can't, then we obviously won't. And that over the contract, this is the important thing to understand, I think, for the audience. The contract supersedes any claims anybody ever makes from a marketing, sales, even the people that are the engineers. If you get to talk directly to those personnel that are writing the code and building the service, nothing any of those people say overrides what's in the contract.
Yeah, pro tip, that's the integration clause I mentioned earlier. That's the piece of language that basically serves to wrap the entirety of the deal inside the four corners of the contract and disclaim as meaningless any other conversations. It's what it does.
Yeah, I also want to point out here that that the contract may say something like, customer agrees to, or there's going to be some language in there that's going to kind of point you to their shared responsibility security model, right? But they're not going to elaborate on it in the contract, and it's really easy to skim over those kinds of terms and conditions. But the shared security model is fundamental to being able to use cloud services securely. And I've never seen any of those details in a contract for all the reasons that we talked about, but it's critically important that you go check it out.
Yeah,
agreed.
Anything else on contracts that you wanted to mention?
Just
Paul?
on contract. they're mostly, easy to read. I mean, I've been impressed with Amazon and Google's contracts, and I've read Microsoft so many times that, by the way, a fun little fact, Microsoft publishes their contract monthly. Every single month, they roll out a new version of their terms of service for cloud. So it's not sufficient to read it once and drop it and forget it. And your terms are the contract when you signed it. So you have to be able to go back in time and see what did I sign rather than what's current.
Well, that's funny because people kind of think of contracts as a once and done, right? I mean, certainly that's true for my mortgage, for other major contracts, like they're cast in stone. But now contracts innovate, so that's really interesting.
Well, it's an innovation of the way that internet and software services work.
Oh yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
It's my old favorite thing. Your continued use of this service, indicates consent to our revised terms. It's the way that we lawyers. Let's not get distracted by that. But it's a major component of almost all contracts that involve, software. So. Kip, let's go ahead and wrap this up. I think this has been a phenomenal episode, lengthy though it may be. So,
well, Paul, we're really grateful that you are our guest today. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing what you know, the wisdom that you've accumulated over the years. Super helpful. Before we wrap it up, I just want to give you an opportunity to tell everybody how they can find you on the internet if you want to be found.
Yeah, I should be easily found on LinkedIn. And I'm happy to connect with people there and bring people into the fold with these communities with the Cloud Security Alliance and the IAPP that I'm a part of. Love to get more volunteers there, and happy to consult with other folks on these topics too.
Great. Yeah. So we're going to put your LinkedIn, the URL to your LinkedIn profile. We're going to put it in the show notes. We do have show notes, sparse as they may be. But thanks, Paul, for being here. And that wraps up this episode of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Today, we went myth busting, specifically targeting common cloud security marketing messages that you'll see out there. And Paul Rich helped us do that. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Remember that cyber risk management is a team sport, so include your senior decision makers, legal department, HR, and IT for full effectiveness. So, if you want to manage cyber as the dynamic business risk it has become, we can help. Find out more by visiting us at cyberriskopportunities.com and focallaw.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.